This is one of two connected sessions which have been put together primarily because of some of the reflections and feedback that we received from many of you through the last regional review process and the IMRF. And during those processes, there was a real request to strengthen the focus on the people at the very centre of the GCM, on migrants, and to strengthen the focus on a discussion around protecting their human rights and saving their lives. Yesterday, we had very thoughtful discussions around the importance of grounding migration narratives in evidence and in facts, and in the stories of migrants, and in the voices and leadership of migrants and other stakeholders. We also talked about the promise of development and the innovation and potential of the Migration Multi-Partner Trust Fund. A thread that ran across all of yesterday's discussions, and that's something that was highlighted both by panelists and participants, were calls or requests for strengthening outcomes for migrants, for strengthening the dignity of migrants, and for strengthening the inclusion of migrants. Or in other words, what it truly means to centre the human being, to centre the migrant in our individual and in our collective action. And in doing so, to truly give effect to the first of the GCM's cross-cutting principles. Are we being people-centred when 60,000 migrants' lives have been lost along migration routes over the past decade? Are we being people-centred when more than 6,000 lives have been lost just last year, and another 100 in the first months of this year? Are we being people-centred when migrant children continue to be detained in the context of migration? The experts who are here with me on the panel today will highlight how we're working on these issues. They will talk about what shifts have been made, what challenges have been encountered, which practices hold promise. They will talk about these things through the lens of saving migrants' lives, protecting migrants' rights, and promoting the dignity and inclusion of migrants. And then the session that follows immediately afterwards will look forward at the road ahead, highlighting the challenges and the barriers that we may continue to face and the shifts that we need to continue to make. So with that, let me introduce our panelists. We have Madeleine Garlick, Miss Madeleine Garlick, who is the Chief of the Protection Policy and Legal Advice Section at UNHCR. We have Mr. Brian Rodas, a coordinator of the Immigrant Policies and Promotion of Decent Work in the city of Sao Paulo, Brazil. We have Miss Melanie Teff, Migration and Displacement Specialist at UNICEF. We have Miss Gabriela Sanchez, Research Fellow on Migration at Georgetown University. And we have Mr. Federico Soda, who is the Director of Operations and Emergencies at the International Organization for Migration. So thank you, colleagues, for engaging in this session. I'm going to hand over now to Madeleine, who will talk a little bit about some of the important shifts that have been made around strengthening complementarity between the Global Compact on Migration and the Global Compact for Refugees. Over to you.
Thank you, Sanjula. And let me first of all really thank all of those partners who have contributed to the work that's gone into organising this event. It's clear that we've put a number of really important issues on the table, and it's been fantastic to see the energy and the commitment around further support to implementation of the Global Compact on Migration at this crucial time. As a member of the Executive Committee of the UN Network on Migration since its establishment, UNHCR has been actively involved with other partners from the UN family, from civil society and other stakeholders in supporting the Global Compact on Migration's implementation since 2018. Today's session for us is a really welcome opportunity to take stock of some of the important achievements that we have collectively made over the last few years. That's not to say that there isn't a great deal of work to be done ahead. On the contrary, we're going to be also talking about that, I hope, in our discussion today. But it's important to look at how far we've come and what we can draw from the results of our work so far. So I'd like to speak about 4 key areas where we do see some real and concrete progress and achievements in the field of protecting migrants' rights and saving their lives and rights that are too often put at grave risk in dangerous, irregular journeys all around the world. The first one, as Sanjula has foreshadowed, relates to greater understanding and acknowledgement of the importance of the complementary implementation of the 2 global compacts. In the spirit of the New York Declaration, the Global Compact on Migration, as the text of the document itself acknowledges, is intended to be implemented in a complementary manner to the Global Compact on Refugees, and vice versa. The Global Compact on Refugees should and does reinforce the effective implementation of the GCM. This means that work that we're all involved in to support the GCM's implementation can and does benefit not only migrants, but also refugees in a myriad of situations where the rights and lives of both are at risk. This means that our work on implementation of objective areas which are common to the 2 compacts, such as tackling immigration detention, addressing the risks around trafficking and smuggling, and greater protection of lives in transit, can bring progress under one of the 2 compacts, which can and will complement efforts in relation to the other. It also concerns different and distinct areas that relate to the separate aims and mandates of each compact, but which can be mutually reinforcing. For instance, advancing rights-based pathways for migrants under the GCM and measures to support safe and dignified return in line with human rights and sustainable reintegration of migrants can alleviate pressure on asylum systems. And in this way, it can contribute to reinforcing the implementation of the GCR, state support to both frameworks, and the related implementation of international and regional refugee law standards. And this is another important point. In examining the complementarity and the relationship between the 2 compacts, it's important for us to recall that these 2 frameworks supplement and aim to reinforce implementation of binding legal standards. We recognise, of course, that the GCR doesn't repeat a lengthy list of procedural or substantive safeguards for refugees, because these have already been established in the 1951 Convention and the broader existing international refugee law framework. But we all recognise that greater efforts are needed to ensure that those standards and principles can be better respected in practice. Similarly, in the GCM as well as the GCR, we see clear tools and strategies to help us ensure better respect for the international human rights law framework, which is too often difficult to see reflected in some of the challenges and the risks that face migrants and refugees moving around the world. This understanding of the value of complementary implementation of the 2 compacts has been increasingly expressed over the last few months, including at the Global Refugee Forum event last December, where a number of partners here were present there, and we heard the High Commissioner for Refugees and IOM's Director General talking about the importance of their work together and with other partners to support the implementation of both. And this brings me then to my next points around some of the progress we've seen in some of the areas which intersect between the 2. I want to recognise the achievements that we've seen in the work that's been done in the UN Migration Network's workstream on alternatives to immigration detention. Co-led by UNHCR and UNICEF, we'll be hearing from Melanie shortly, who'll talk in more detail about this workstream, as well as the International Detention Coalition as a 3rd key partner, This work stream has collected and disseminated promising practices in the use of alternatives to detention in ways that have opened up possibilities and attracted the interest of states which haven't used these approaches before. And crucially, this work also helped to support mobilize some really important pledges that were made by states and other stakeholders during the IMRF and more recently in the lead up to the Global Refugee Forum in December 2023 in ways that extend, amplify and mutually reinforce the work that is going to be done under both compacts in this area. This culminated in the announcement of a multi-stakeholder pledge in the course of the Global Refugee Forum on developing alternatives to immigration detention and ending immigration detention of asylum-seeking, refugee, stateless and migrant children and their families, where we hope to see concrete work done over the next few months to implement that and take it forward. The third area I want to mention is the work that's been done in the UN Migration Network's workstream on safe and dignified return and readmission and sustainable reintegration. And this workstream, co-led with UNICEF, MPI and IOM, has developed guidance in the form of a detailed checklist on the implementation of Objective 21 of the Global Compact on Migration. But it's also rolled out this guidance in concrete, practical ways at regional level in close cooperation with some of the concerned regional networks. And this work is ongoing to ensure that this tool is going to have an impact on the ground on the lives of affected people. We had a peer learning event in Honduras, for example, on which there is a report which is available for those who are interested that really demonstrate the potential of this work. In UNHCR's discussions with states and regional organisations, we see this issue of return emerging as a key priority for states. So that we hope in the discussion we have today and in subsequent work, we're going to have an opportunity to talk about how we can work in partnership to define the potential role of the network in this context and look at the way in which rights compliant return in safety and dignity can be given greater attention and reflected as a renewed priority in the work plan of the network going forward. Last but not least, as a member of the work stream on enhancing regular pathways for migrants in vulnerable situations, UNHCR is very encouraged to see the network efforts to promote the implementation of its guidance at the regional and country levels. This is going to be crucial also to prevent dangerous journeys and to offer migrants alternatives in host countries, which would obviate the need for many of them to resort to the asylum procedure as a means to try and stay. So in closing, I just want to recognise the enormous cooperation and the fruitful collaboration that we have seen in the work of these work streams and other aspects of the network's work over the last few years. Together, we've achieved much more than we would have been able to achieve alone. We've learned a great deal as UNHCR, and we're really looking forward to taking that work further over the months and years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madeleine. And thank you. I think it's really valuable to hear of these dual ways in which the two documents really complement each other. On one side, the fact that the same themes such as detention, pathways and return and reintegration are explicitly or implicitly covered in both documents and need to be implemented in a complementary way. And then on the other hand, how implementing the commitments in one document can lead to better implementation, enhanced implementation of the commitments in the other documents. So thank you. Brian, Madeleine highlighted complementarity at the global level. The city of Sao Paulo has simultaneously committed to both instruments and pledged through the local call to action for migrants and refugees, and also established welcoming policies at the local level. It would be great to hear how complementarity is working at that local level and more about your work. Thank you.
Buenos días, estimados migrantes, estimadas migrantes, representantes de Estado, organizaciones de la sociedad civil, organismos internacionales y demás partes interesadas. Muy grato por poder estar compartiendo esta mesa con todos ustedes y aprendiendo muchas cosas. Mi nombre es Brian Rodas, soy migrante boliviano Soy actual coordinador de políticas para inmigrantes y promoción del trabajo decente de la Secretaría Municipal de Derechos Humanos y Ciudadanía de São Paulo, Brasil. Y en nombre de la ciudad agradezco la oportunidad de poder compartir un poco de la experiencia y trayectoria de São Paulo en la construcción de políticas públicas para la población inmigrante, que desde hace esos tiempos ya viene reforzando la necesidad de reconocer esas poblaciones, ese territorio y construir junto con ellas políticas públicas de garantía, protección de sus derechos. El municipio de São Paulo tiene una larga historia de contacto con flujos migratorios y de presentación de servicios a estos inmigrantes, principalmente a lo largo del siglo XIX, con migraciones de países como Italia, Portugal, España y Japón. Con las migraciones contemporáneas, la presencia y la heterogeneidad de esos se expresan en los datos más actuales. La ciudad hoy en día posee 400.000 residentes migrantes, lo que corresponde a 3% de su población. Entre 2020 y octubre de 2023, las principales nacionalidades registradas fueron la boliviana, venezolana, angoleña, haitiana y china. A un pequeño recorte de las 130 más nacionalidades que ya tuvimos registro en nuestra ciudad. Pero sin embargo, solo fue a partir de 2013 que el gobierno municipal demostró institucionalmente la importancia y el reconocimiento de las migraciones contemporáneas en su territorio, con la creación de la Coordinación de Políticas para Inmigrantes dentro de la estructura de la Secretaría de Derechos Humanos. Eso fue un paso fundamental porque primero demostró el compromiso del municipio con el desarrollo de capacidades estatales para promover y garantizar los derechos de las personas inmigrantes, así como reconoció y legitimó la presencia y las demandas de esas poblaciones que años anteriores ya pedían por señales de construcción de una política pública estructurada. Y por fin, porque fundó un actor de gobernanza local con el rol de transversalizar e intersectorializar la agenda dentro de la estructura estatal y promover el desarrollo de políticas basadas en los derechos humanos. Siendo así, el objetivo central de la coordinación en su fundación fue iniciar un proceso de institucionalizar una política municipal para la población inmigrante que manteniese la relación con la sociedad civil a través de diálogos abiertos y la construcción de ambientes de participación y consulta social, como fue el caso de la primera conferencia municipal de inmigrantes en 2013 y la creación del Comité Intersectorial para redactar la ley en 2015. Además de involucrar a toda la estructura sectorial del poder público desde una perspectiva de construcción de corresponsabilidad con gran sesgo hacia la transversalización e intersectorialización de la elaboración e implementación de esa política. En ese sentido, luego después de 3 años de trabajo, en 2016 se institucionalizó la Ley 16478 y el Decreto 57533 que compone la política para la población inmigrante de la ciudad de São Paulo. Esta política adopta un paradigma impulsionado por los derechos, independiente del estatus migratorio documental del inmigrante. Además, se pretende implementar un trabajo intersecretarial e intersectorial bajo la gestión de la coordinación. La política advierte que la gobernanza migratoria se guíe por la siguiente definición de migrante. Son todas las personas que se trasladan de su lugar de residencia habitual en otro país a Brasil, incluyendo los inmigrantes laborales, los estudiantes, las personas en situación de refugio, los apátridas, así como sus familias, independiente de su situación migratoria documental. Fue un hito en las políticas a nivel local y nacional en Brasil, y además fue la presentación de un nuevo paradigma sobre la migración, el inmigrante y el papel de las políticas públicas en eso. Más aún si tenemos en cuenta que en aquel momento, a nivel nacional, la legislación central que trataba de la materia migratoria era el Estatuto de Extranjero, una política adoptada por el régimen militar brasileño que criminalizaba la migración y vulnerabilizaba a los inmigrantes. Siendo así, la formación de un actor de gobernanza migratoria dentro de la administración pública y la construcción de un marco legal con fuerte legitimidad ante la sociedad civil permitieron adoptar una política de Estado y desarrollar acciones de la perspectiva de promover, garantizar y proteger los derechos de los inmigrantes en la ciudad. Acciones desenvolvidas que se pueden dividir en diferentes enfoques. El enfoque por el desarrollo de la intersectorialidad y transversalización a través de la implementación de una red de servicios especializada como el caso del Centro de Referencia y Atención para Migrantes, como un lugar público de apoyo y referencia a las políticas sociales, pero también como actor estratégico en el territorio para fortalecer la red de servicios públicos y la sociedad civil. Acciones de implementación de programas de cualificación y sensibilización de trabajadores de áreas públicas, de media y de burocracia de calle, como proceso de horizontalización y verticalización del paradigma de la política. Acciones de construcción intersecretarial de programas de acogida, como el caso del programa Portas Abiertas de enseñanza de portugués como idioma de acogida, implementado entre la Secretaría de Derechos Humanos y la Secretaría de Educación. Un segundo enfoque por la participación como elemento central en el ciclo de las políticas públicas. La acción de garantía y participación del inmigrante en cualquier espacio de participación social del poder público local, pero sobre todo la fundación de un Consejo Municipal de Inmigrantes que institucionalizó la participación social del inmigrante en la ciudad, donde el poder público y la sociedad civil se focalizan en el ciclo de la política pública de la elaboración a la evaluación. Esa estructura posibilita la incidencia de la sociedad civil y de las poblaciones inmigrantes en las decisiones del poder público, pero también en la construcción de instrumentos de gestión de manera participativa. Ejemplo de eso que es en 2020 lanzamos junto con el Consejo Municipal de Inmigrantes el primer plano de políticas de inmigrantes, el cual es compuesto por 8 ejes estratégicos, 80 acciones programáticas y 131 metas e indicadores. Y por fin, un tercer enfoque, que es el fortalecimiento de la actuación de la sociedad civil por medio del apoyo en el desenvolvimiento de proyectos conjuntos como mecanismo de fortalecimiento de las redes de protección, garantía de los derechos y combate a diversas formas de violencia. Y así como apoyar festividades culturales de los inmigrantes con el objetivo de promover el derecho a la ciudad y a la interculturalidad como instrumento de combate a discursos nocivos. Finalizando, son en los barrios, en las escuelas, en nuestros puestos de trabajo. Es en el diario que nosotros los inmigrantes modificamos económicamente, culturalmente, políticamente los tejidos de las ciudades. Es evidente que nosotros ya somos sujetos activos en ese proceso, en toda nuestra trayectoria migratoria. El paradigma está con nosotros y es con nosotros. El ejemplo de São Paulo evidencia que las mudanzas y la construcción de políticas públicas pueden ser para el sujeto inmigrante, pero principalmente con el sujeto inmigrante. Muchas gracias.
Thanks, Brian. And thanks very much also for demonstrating why cities are crucial for achieving global migration goals and commitments, and for showing how this can be done in a way that centers the person in both policy and in practice. Thanks a lot. Melanie, I'm handing it back to you now to bring us back to the global level and talk about some of the work that have been done on children, on detention, on return perhaps as well, and particularly also through some of the UN Network on Migration work streams. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And really, one of the groundbreaking elements of the GCM is its recognition that children are central to migration management, and that plans for safe, orderly and regular migration simply don't work if children's needs, rights and views aren't front and center in the process. And to ensure migrant children's rights, it's essential for safeguards to be put in place. Otherwise, they can be overlooked. And particularly for children in families, where the focus tends to be on discussion and planning about the family's future with the adults. And if children aren't central to the process, this results in a lack of child-sensitive support for integration or reintegration into the communities where they're living. It can lead to children missing out on education and proper medical care, and it can create risks such as child labor or early marriage. And without safe routes and pathways that take children's rights and needs into account, children may be exposed to aggravated smuggling or trafficking, putting them at risk of violence and exploitation. Sadly, 35% of trafficking victims are children. And of course, unaccompanied and separated children face particular heightened challenges and risks that require specific safeguards. And we shouldn't forget the impacts on children of the absence of parents who've migrated for work, which may impact a child's protection and may increase risks to them, especially if they don't have continuing contact with their parents and if they're not supported by in-country guardians and communities. But today I'll highlight a couple of important actions taken by the network over the past year on implementing the GCM guiding principle of child sensitivity. So firstly, we were talking yesterday about the Migration Multi-Partner Trust Fund, the MPTF, which has set a good example by adopting a child sensitivity marker at its steering committee meeting in February last year. And that's the first child sensitivity marker for a joint UN fund. So the child sensitivity marker requires agencies submitting proposals to have considered potential positive and negative impacts of the project on children. And that's whether the impacts are intended or unintended, at a minimum for MPTF projects to do no harm for children. For all projects submitting to the MPTF, they're asked to consider a basic child rights impact assessment and how child protection and safeguarding will be dealt with in the joint program. For programs that are self-assessed as higher on the marker, agencies are asked to consider several elements specific to children, such as meaningful engagement of children. To be clear, projects don't fail the child sensitivity marker if then they don't have specific results for children. They only fail if the agencies submitting fail to go through the process of considering potential impacts on children, or if they don't reach basic requirements on child protection and safeguarding. And this process also helps the MPTF steering committee to identify child-focused proposals. Through the marker, the MPTF tracks allocation of funding for children, and it reports to member states, donors, and partners on its results. So one example of joint programming that's been submitted to the MPTF that would support child sensitivity of GCM implementation is a 3-country initiative to support appropriate care and reception models for unaccompanied migrant children in the Middle East and North African region. So this joint program aims to reduce abuse and exploitation of migrant children, to increase their social inclusion, and to work towards ending child immigration detention. If funded, as we hope it soon will be, and of course that's dependent on more resources coming to the fund, as we were discussing in the session yesterday, this regional initiative would be implemented in 3 transit and destination countries. And it'd be the first example of an A-rated program under the child sensitivity marker. We haven't had one of those yet. The documentation, evaluation, and peer learning elements of this joint program would provide an evidence base and a sharing of experiences to assist governments and stakeholders in the region and also globally. It would aim to strengthen national child protection systems for all children and systems for identification, screening, and referral for vulnerable migrant children. It would improve cross-border case management and coordination and family tracing and reunification. So it would be a cross-border and route-based continuum of protection and care for migrant children that doesn't utilize immigration detention. And then it would aim to spread these positive models and practices. And that's a good segue to my second point, which is the network's work on child immigration detention, which was referred to by Madeline. Regardless of the conditions in which children are held, detention has a profound and negative impact on child health and development. Immigration detention of children, whether they're alone or with their families, is never in their best interests. It's a child rights violation, and it should not be used even as a measure of last resort. Therefore, it's a high priority for UNICEF to support states in working to end immigration detention of children and families. And so the work of the work stream, the network's work stream on alternatives to detention, the ATD work stream, which has been organizing peer learning exchanges between states, has been really important. Last year, the ATD work stream, together with the governments of Colombia, Mexico, Portugal, and Thailand, organized a global peer learning exchange on working to end child immigration detention. And this provided an opportunity for states to share examples of steps forward they'd taken, which are laid out in the report of the event, which is on the website. I won't list those now, but I'm happy to go into details later if there's interest. But I will read out one quote from a government representative who spoke at the event about the importance of these peer learning exchanges. And they said that from our experience, peer learning exchange has led to practical solutions derived from lessons learned and frank discussions. Policymakers and frontline officers also benefit from these solutions in moving forward alternatives to detention. And just prior to this event last year, the network ATD work stream also supported MYCP, the Migration, Youth and Children's Platform, to organize the first ever global youth consultation on ending child immigration detention. And here's a quote from one of the youth advocates. She noted that people are taking the time to include me in discussing what can be done to help my brothers and sisters who are still in detention. Youth-led organizations are working for children's release and are welcoming those children into the communities. And there are other recent examples of the network's work on children's rights. Madeleine noted the complementarity being put into practice with the network work stream advocating for mirror pledges on alternatives to detention and ending child immigration detention at the Global Refugee Forum. Also, the event in Honduras that was mentioned about return, readmission and reintegration, that had a very strong focus on child rights and child protection. And that was, I think, also an important step taken by the network of rolling out child protection, which is part of that work plan of the return and reintegration work stream. So these are important steps in the right direction, but none of these steps convert into change for children without the necessary political will. And so much more is still needed. UNICEF estimates that since 2018, around 1,500 children have died or gone missing while attempting the central Mediterranean sea crossing, just one of the many dangerous routes where children's lives have been lost or their futures permanently damaged. At least 330,000 children are held in immigration detention each year. The network has a key role to play in protecting migrant children's rights and saving lives. And we must measure the network's work against the GCM guiding principle of child sensitivity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melanie. And also for really showing that even as we center the human being, center the migrant, we also need to consider particular groups within the migrant population and particularly groups who are especially vulnerable, such as children, and how we can better center the person in a range of key thematic areas that affect their lives and affect their rights. So thanks a lot. Gabriella, over to you. I think the issue of risks and harms to children come up quite a lot in the migrant smuggling space and in the challenges that are faced in addressing smuggling. So over to you to cover this issue. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Buenos días a todos y a todas. My name is Gabriela Sanchez, and I'm a research fellow at Georgetown University, and I am part of the work stream on the smuggling of migrants. That's and part of our conversation today and what we've been talking about over the last few months, I think, as part of the work stream, are some of the challenges that are related to data when it comes to migrant smuggling. Globally, the migrant smuggling discourse has had a tendency to focus on the need to dismantle smuggling, on its depiction as a form of transnational organized crime, and on the security risks that are posed by its business model. I think these are key elements that we just keep hearing over and over when it comes to the narrative on irregular migration. And there is, in fact, ample recognition of the threat exploitative smuggling practices have on people on the move. I think all of us here are quite aware, because this has been widely documented, of the forms of violence people experience in origin, transit, and destination countries. An increasing number of countries has also signed agreements to collaborate in the fight against the smuggling, and counter-smuggling efforts have become the norm along the migration pathway. I was looking at the participants in today's conferences, and I think, I visited many of these countries where these agreements or, attempts to collaborate at fighting and countering smuggling occur. And yet, there is virtually no official data concerning counter-smuggling. We have no official sources concerning the outcomes of most of these efforts. And the widespread lack of official data sources concerning the profile of those arrested and charged, but especially on information on prosecutions and sentences related to migrant smuggling, prevents us from evaluating the impact of counter-smuggling activities. And most troubling, raises concerns over the human rights implications of the criminalization of the facilitation of irregular migration. We have this idea of the smuggler, of this evil persona, that is out there. But we don't really have a lot of data concerning who is actually behind these crimes. There's a strong body of evidence at the same time that has been compiled primarily by civil society that demonstrates that many of those who find themselves in the criminal justice system as a result of their alleged involvement in smuggling are people on the move themselves, acting without any kind of financial motivation. Data shows that in order to offset smuggling fees, many people on the move, and this is especially the case of children and women, often perform smuggling-related tasks to save their lives and those of others. In line with Article 5 of the UNODC smuggling protocol, these men, women, and children should not be facing criminal liability. And yet we have specific examples that show that the opposite has actually occurred. One, there's an increasing participation of children and young people in smuggling as a way to reach safety. Between 2013 and 2021, at least 2,500 young men have been charged with smuggling, and this is in the case of the Mediterranean, despite the existence of prosecutorial, recognition that many of them acted in an attempt to save their lives and those of others. The second point that is very troubling, is the fact that indigenous people on the move are increasingly being detained in the context of counter-smuggling operations and systematically denied access to interpreters or counsel. This was the case of a Maya woman, Juana Alonso, last year, who spent 7 years in prison without a trial, accused of migrant kidnapping after being forced to sign an incriminatory statement written in a language that she couldn't read or write. Third point is that people on the move who, without financial or material motivation, perform smuggling-related tasks in tragic cases involving the loss of life, also receive disproportionately long sentences, sometimes in the hundreds of years. And that the provision of humanitarian assistance, including the kind provided by smuggled people on the move themselves, is often constructed by the law as a form of smuggling. There is, again, growing evidence that the introduction of smuggling legislation has led to the criminalization of the livelihoods and mobility mechanisms of which tribal, indigenous, and native peoples around the world have historically relied. Countries that are not signatories of the UNODC's smuggling protocol also lack legal mechanisms ensuring the protection of the rights of people on the move who are smuggled. We also note, as part of our work with the work stream, that efforts to contain irregular migration and to counter smuggling networks largely compromise the safety of people on the move. Not smugglers, not criminal networks. And this increasingly leads to their criminalization, detention, and death. What do we need to do? First, to ensure the implementation of mechanisms preventing the criminalization of people on the move, object of smuggling. Again, the vast majority, but the data that we have available shows that we are not going after networks. And the people who are being apprehended, tend to be people on the move themselves. We also need to examine the impacts of counter-smuggling efforts worldwide, taking stock of the existing evidence and in ways that mainstream gender, child protection, and human rights perspectives. Something that is also imperative is to collect and especially make widely accessible, reliable official data concerning criminal justice efforts to counter smuggling. In line with what my colleagues have mentioned earlier, and there's also the urgency to eliminate child migration detention and to address the administrative hurdles that reduce equal, and I think this is the key word, equal access to safe, regular, and orderly migration in line with the Global Compact on Migration. And last but not least, to devise solutions to prevent the criminalization of smuggled people on the move and those who work to save their lives. I appreciate your time and attention. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gabriella, and for really demystifying this space around the discourse and the practice of migrant smuggling, and highlighting also that some of the practices, some of the policies that we're putting in place, which are aimed at countering migrant smuggling, may in fact actually be harming the very people that we're trying to protect, people on the move, including people who are children. I think it's also really valuable to hear that we need to better understand and engage with the evidence on the impact of migrant smuggling and to do it better so that our policies and practices are in fact evidence-based and can be right-centred, people-centred. Federico, last but not least, I'm going to hand over to you to, I guess, really talk a little bit more about how we started this discussion around the fact that 60,000 lives have been lost along migrant routes over the last decade, 100 just this year. And to also highlight some of the work that's been undertaken by the UN Network on Migration Workstream on Missing Migrants and Humanitarian Assistance to Migrants in Distress, which is being co-led by IOM, UNHCR, ICRC, and IFRC. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sanjola. Good morning, distinguished delegates, colleagues. Today, I'll be speaking about preventing loss of life in transit, and more specifically on the recommendations that the network is developing as mandated through the IMRF Progress Declaration on Missing Migrants and Humanitarian Assistance to Migrants in Distress. We've heard some of the figures in terms of the dead and missing over the last decade, 60,000. I don't like to contextualize this issue with numbers on a dashboard, but let's just say that the situation and the trends are heading in the wrong direction. And the IOM data indicates that more people died in 2023 than in any other year in the last decade. This issue, therefore, is as important as ever. And 2024 presents us with two very concrete opportunities to reinvigorate our commitments to saving the lives of migrants, and these issues more broadly also to those that have died and gone missing. So the first is what I already referred to, which is the finalization of the recommendations on missing migrants and provisions of humanitarian assistance to migrants in distress, which will be included in the Secretary General's next report on GCM implementation. And the network, through a work stream, which is co-led by IOM, ICRC, IFRC, and UNHCR, have developed draft recommendations. And what I would like to do now is give you an overview of this draft. They cover three main areas: prevention, what can be done about the dead and the missing, and better records. So on prevention, the recommendations highlight the need to prevent migrants from dying or going missing. And some actions that are mentioned include the creation of independent review bodies to assess the impact of migration-related laws, policies, and practices on migrant death and disappearances. They also refer to the need to provide migrants and their family the means to establish, restore, and maintain contact throughout their migration journey, including in places of detention and at border crossings. Too often, the link with the family or the community in the country of origin is lost. We need effective and dignified search and rescue at sea, but cannot overlook pressing issues on land as well, and where there are vast areas of land in isolated places of the world that are through which important migratory routes move. We need to set up early warning systems and define common sets of triggers which can contribute to coordinated humanitarian responses, including in the context of large flows of migrants, and ensure that life-saving assistance is needs-based and multi-sectoral and inclusive, very importantly, of mental health and psychosocial support. Because this isn't just about the dead and the missing, but it's also about the survivors and those that make it, that observe horrific, witness horrific events and incidents. We need to facilitate humanitarian actors to carry out independent duties that are separate from political agendas in order to allow adherence to the principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. On the second point about what can be done specifically on the identity of the dead and missing, we have some asks primarily of governments about how they can step up and support. First, we need to standardize approaches to register cases of missing persons. Appointing national focal points for transnational cooperation is also an important part of this to ensure that the requests that are received can be shared with other institutions and that the information can flow easily between countries. Allowing other countries to access biometric data for identification purposes of the dead and missing is also one of the recommendations. And finally, providing critical legal documentation such as certificates of absence or presumed death certificates, which can help address very practical but immensely important issues such as control of property and guardianship of children. On the last point, on better records, the recommendations highlight the need to better record what is happening and strengthen the knowledge base on this issue. I'm not talking about data, but I'm talking about the records of individuals. The Missing Migrants Project is very helpful and has been groundbreaking in presenting a picture of the trends of migrants' deaths and disappearances, but much more needs to be done. Particularly since the Missing Migrant Project relies heavily on media reporting, and because we know that many deaths and disappearances go unreported, particularly along routes that receive less attention, such as the southern route in Africa, this is an area of focus for us. Against this backdrop, we are recommending collecting and consolidating government data on missing and the dead to help orientate policy and action and to have truly comprehensive data on migrant death and disappearances. Collecting and consolidating data and research on how life-saving humanitarian action in transit is being provided needs to be strengthened, but also how this is obstructed along some roads, not just the Mediterranean. And finally, developing and strengthening systems for the collection, management, centralization, and systemization of data on all unidentified human remains. This is an overview of the recommendations which we will continue to refine. We've also received inputs this week through regional consultations in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And then these recommendations will be included in the SG's report, which will be launched in December of this year. The second opportunity we have to reinvigorate our commitment to saving lives is the GCM regional reviews, which will take place this year and continue into 2025. In the last round of regional reviews, the issue of saving lives received too little attention. For example, only 17% of member states who submitted reviews responded to GCM Objective 8. And most of these inputs focused on efforts related to border management or missing nationals abroad. The regional reviews are an opportunity to showcase the progress in implementing Objective 8 of the GCM, but also to identify challenges and solutions. As I close, let's keep in mind the countless families who have lost a loved one, a brother, a sister, a spouse, a child, as we work on these issues and try to advance the agenda in 2024. 2024 is indeed affording us to commit once again to this important issue, including by providing necessary humanitarian assistance to migrants in distress and to better coordinate international efforts on the missing. Thank you.
Thanks, Federico. And thanks really for highlighting this issue through the lens of three key areas: prevention, action on the dead and missing, and strengthening the knowledge base. I think you've really shown how much can be achieved if we really do emphasize the prevention dimension of this angle, because ultimately that is the way that we can safeguard lives and we can promote the rights of all the people who are affected. Thanks also for really showing that this is not an issue that is just relevant to the sea. Often that's what's highlighted in the media, and that's what's very prominent, but that it's also an issue that's taking place along land-based routes that migrants take. And then finally, this point around not just the data, but the knowledge and the stories, so that coming back to yesterday, we're centering the person, we're understanding what's happened to the human beings that experience these situations. So with that, I think that's the end of the presentation from all of the panelists, and we're going to open up the floor for your interventions. Before we do that, I think you probably remember the drill from yesterday. We have Slido again, and it would be great, since everyone won't get to speak in the next 20 or so minutes that we have, if you can take a moment to scan the QR code or go to slido.com and enter the number that's on your screen and provide an answer to the themes and issues that we've been discussing today. And the key question really from our end is, what is a key challenge when it comes to saving migrant lives and protecting their human rights? So please do engage, and great to see visibility coming up straight away. And if we have time at the end, I will try and highlight some of the key messages that you are putting on Slido as well. I know that we have a number of representatives who want to speak, and I would like to first hand over to the representative from Colombia.
Muchas gracias, Anjula, y muy buenos días para todos. En primer lugar, quisiera resaltar la participación del señor Rodas como coordinador de políticas de migración en Sao Paulo, porque él mismo, como migrante boliviano, es una muestra clara de la importancia de integrar a los migrantes en nuestros países y reitera el ejemplo de la región de América Latina en esta materia. Colombia no tiene centros de detención de migrantes. Colombia no detiene niños. Y Colombia es un ejemplo para demostrar que independientemente del número de migrantes que cruzan las fronteras, no es necesario detener ni criminalizar la migración. Y el número de migrantes que ha venido a nuestro país con vocación de permanencia o en tránsito hacia la zona del Darién es efectivamente muy alto. Por eso, como países campeones del Pacto Mundial para una Migración Segura, Ordenada y Regular, y en el marco del Examen Mundial para la Migración con el apoyo de UNICEF y la Coalición contra la Detención de Migrantes, hicimos un pledge relacionado con el liderazgo de Colombia al no utilizar la detención de migrantes. A raíz del Foro Mundial sobre Refugiados, nos comprometimos a hacer un espejo de este pledge como una muestra de la complementariedad de ambos pactos. Con el apoyo tanto de UNICEF, OIM, ACNUR y el Relator Especial para los Derechos de los Migrantes y la Coalición contra la Detención de Migrantes, así como un número importante y significativo de estados que tienen legislaciones efectivas, vamos a seguir trabajando para proteger a los niños migrantes y sus familias. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I can also see that the representative from OHCHR would like to speak.
Good morning, everyone. The 5th UN Network Annual Meeting provides a timely opportunity to reflect on what more can be done to make the Global Compact for Migration promise of safe, orderly, and regular migration a reality. OHCHR have observed in many countries worldwide increasing restrictively migration and border governance measures, including criminalization of migration and impunity for violation of migrants' rights, and lack of sufficient pathways for safe and regular migration. The Global Compact for Migration provides an important opportunity to improve migration governance and a roadmap for addressing migration challenges faced by migrants by prioritizing the protection of human rights and putting migrants at the center. Addressing those challenges is the responsibility of all countries and requires multi-stakeholder efforts involving both local and national authorities, UN entities, CSOs, national human rights institutions, and other key stakeholders, as well as migrants themselves. OHCHR welcomes the increased engagement among member states, UN entities, civil society, and other key stakeholders with the aim of saving life and prevent the deaths and disappearance of migrants through more determined and effective actions, including through the creation of new and enhancement of existing pathways for safe and regular migration. OHCHR stands ready to offer its support for the operationalization of the network guidance note on regular pathways for admission and stay of migrants in situations of vulnerability that was developed by the co-leads OHCHR and ACT Alliance with the support of the working group members to support member states and other stakeholders to strengthen the design, implementation, monitoring, and review of pathways for migrants in vulnerable situations. Heightened engagement between member states, UN entities, and other key stakeholders is urgently needed to save life and prevent migrants from going missing. As the Secretary General recommended in its 2023 report on the human rights of migrants, more determined and effective action must be ensured, including by providing prompt and effective assistance to migrants in distress, strengthening search and rescue efforts, and ensuring timely and safe disembarkation, fostering information exchange and cooperation to locate and identify missing persons involving families and relevant stakeholders, avoid criminalizing organizations and individuals who assist migrants, ensuring access to justice, accountability, and redress for migrants by conducting independent investigation into allegation of failure to assist migrants in distress. OHCHR stands ready to support efforts by all states and stakeholders to protect migrants' human rights, address and prevent migrants' loss of life, disappearances, and other serious human rights violations against them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And now to the representative for the Foundation for Justice and Blocker, Latin America.
Como Fundación para la Justicia, venimos como sociedad civil que apoyamos técnicamente a nivel jurídico y de incidencia en política pública a comités de familias de personas migrantes desaparecidas en Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador y México. Acompañamos desde un enfoque de género, psicosocial y transnacional a víctimas de desapariciones, graves violaciones a derechos humanos, homicidios debido a la xenofobia y masacres contra personas migrantes. Representamos casos que nadie quiere representar jurídicamente porque se piensa que son imposibles de llevar a nivel penal, constitucional o de litigio estratégico. De esta manera es que como parte del bloque latinoamericano y de ROCOM, impulsamos trabajar en integración con los gobiernos a nivel nacional, regional y transnacional en temas de identificación, repatriación de restos y cuerpos encontrados en México y Estados Unidos. Muchas veces hemos encontrado en fosas clandestinas en México o en ranchos privados en el desierto estadounidense. Hemos impulsado junto a las familias y al equipo argentino de antropología forense mecanismos de búsqueda e investigación, porque creemos que esta labor tiene que ver con la cooperación de diversos sectores, claramente liderada por los estados, y que la situación es tan grave que también requiere profundas soluciones. El Pacto Mundial nos ha abierto una puerta mediante el Objetivo 8. Ha abierto una oportunidad a todos los sectores a no dejar de cumplir con los estándares internacionales de protección a derechos humanos. Ha abierto una oportunidad a prevenir la desaparición, a dar respuestas concretas a las familias que están buscando desde su país de origen. Salvar vidas y hacer búsqueda de personas desaparecidas es una prioridad diaria y concreta para las familias. Un trabajo que nos concierne a todos y todas, liderado por los estados en su deber de protección. Eso incluye apoyar a las familias en su dolor continuo, a diario, desde que se despierta, hace la comida y se sube al transporte público. El continuo de la desaparición es una tortura diaria que se traduce también en condiciones de salud ante tal impacto. Hay miles de familias exigiendo la búsqueda y el acceso a la justicia. Nadie está esperando que su hijo desaparezca, pero sí están trabajando todas las familias para que los mecanismos de búsqueda y acceso a la justicia que incluso ya existen sí funcionen y se den respuestas concretas. Hay ya caminos que se pueden fortalecer y que ya cuentan con trabajos intersectoriales. Es fundamental definitivamente fortalecer el enfoque transnacional. Llevamos muchos años en esto y no estamos partiendo de cero. Hay avances impulsados ya por las mismas familias de personas migrantes desaparecidas. Hay muchísimo que fortalecer, eso sí, con el apoyo de los estados, los mecanismos y los procedimientos especiales de las Naciones Unidas. Debemos trabajar desde una mirada de cooperación transnacional entre países para la búsqueda en vida y las personas fallecidas. Utilizar nuevas tecnologías, comprender los contextos de la desaparición y de las mujeres que son en su mayoría quienes están haciendo la búsqueda. Debemos situar a las familias como personas independientemente de su nacionalidad, con el derecho a que se busque y a que se investigue, con el derecho a saber dónde están sus seres queridos. No deberían haber más personas desaparecidas. Esta es una realidad que está ocurriendo en este mismo y preciso momento en las diversas regiones en el mundo. La desaparición afecta a la familia, a la comunidad y a la sociedad en su conjunto. El derecho a la verdad y a la justicia es una deuda que debe tener apuestas reales de avance. Muchas gracias por la participación.
Thank you very much. I'm going to now hand over to the representative from the UK.
Thank you very much, and thank you for providing the space in this year's agenda for this important discussion. The increasingly uncertain global situation is clearly impacting human mobility. This is why we must come together to implement the global compacts. And when we talk about the implementation and protecting migrants, it would be remiss of us to not mention the dangers faced by those who choose to migrate irregularly. The worryingly high figures noted by IOM of more than 60,000 people who've died whilst attempting to migrate is a matter of growing concern, both in the UK and many other countries at the highest levels. And in that context, our collective vision for the future must remain one that ensures safe, orderly, and legal migration. To protect lives, we need to work together to reduce the incentives to undertake irregular and dangerous journeys and to tackle the scourge of organised immigration crime and people smuggling networks. This is why the UK is expanding our work to tackle upstream migration and to address the root causes. And I want to mention the experience of a former Ethiopian police officer who my colleagues recently met. Unable to find stable employment in Ethiopia, he had planned originally to migrate to the Middle East, but could not afford the costly private employment agency fees. Through the UK's Better Regional Migration Management Programme, which provides socio-economic reintegration support for potential migrants in the East and the Horn of Africa, he received training in entrepreneurship and financial education, which helped him to unlock the confidence and skills to develop a new business, now enabling him to both make a living and to contribute to the wider economy and his community in Ethiopia. When managed safely and effectively, migration can clearly have a positive impact on origin and host communities. We need to make sure that we're supporting countries of origin and transit to manage the economic and social drivers of irregular migration, but also to build stronger, safer, and more prosperous communities. Simultaneously, we must take a coordinated and comprehensive approach to dismantling the mechanisms used by organised crime groups, facilitating those dangerous irregular migration routes that take so many lives and put so many lives at risk. Together, through innovative solutions, we can address the challenges and realise the benefits of global migration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're meant to finish in about 5 minutes, and I also want to hand over to the panelists for some final remarks. So I'm going to take the liberty of saying that we might finish 5 or 10 minutes later than originally anticipated, so about 11:25 or 11:30, partly because we started a little late as well. And hopefully you don't mind having a coffee break for about 20 minutes. So first, now to the representative of UNODC.
Thank you very much. As a co-lead of the smuggling of migrants work stream that Gabriela is representing us right now on the panel, we're very proud to have her there. And really thank you for outlining all the issues that are coming up and addressing migrant smuggling. And we think it's really a wonderful precedent where the network has brought together people working on the humanitarian side and of saving lives, as well as the criminal justice side, to jointly try and address both the needs that come up in this situation, as well as some of the situations that create the vulnerability in the first place, especially in an environment where we have discussed that there's the risk of politicization of migration. The need to really amplify the human rights of migrants is critical at this point. And in our work stream, we hope to reinforce the principle that human rights apply regardless of somebody's immigration status. And the human rights of refugees to reach safety should not be blocked, even in the context of countering migrant smuggling. And we hope to produce research and guidance that will support more effective law enforcement action in identifying and disrupting criminal networks, but while also ensuring that the rights of migrants are upheld, especially issues such as their access to justice for abuses against them, which happen at origin and in transit, as well as just making sure that the actual perpetrators are the ones who are apprehended in the efforts that are happening. So I'd like to just, the last thing is just to let people know that the work stream launched some guidance addressing the nuances of migrant smuggling. And for those who have not had a look at it, would like to refer you to the network's website to have a look at that, so we can continue to engage on how to truly have a human rights-based response to countering migrant smuggling. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Now to the representative from PICUM.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the network for organizing this very interesting meeting and to hear all of these examples of good practice. Many of us from civil society are part of the different working groups, have contributed to the various resources. And so we recognize the amount of work that's been done. But at the same time, we're also talking about the implementation of the Global Compact. And it's very challenging to see kind of the reality on the ground that we're all very aware of, where we see basically an enforcement type of approach to migration, which is overshadowing many of the good practices that we're highlighting collectively in this space and also through those resources. And I wanted to give a couple as examples, but also maybe other ways that we can think of going forward. And so how do we see this enforcement approach to migration playing out? The first one is through language. It might seem a little bit innocent, but it's always where it starts. An example is we had an excellent first panel on narratives, a wonderful panel, inspirational even. And yet we heard the word illegal migration said twice in that opening panel and no comment on it. Another way that it's playing out is through border management. We've heard kind of ad nauseum about pushbacks, and the amount of violence at borders throughout the world is really frightening, to be honest. We've heard about people being disappeared, even in the comments now that have just been given from colleagues from Latin America as well. And I wanted to give two examples of how this is also playing out on the EU level. So as December 18th, International Migrants Day was wrapping up, the EU achieved political agreement on the EU Pact on Migration and Asylum. And one of the areas that's been politically agreed on in the pact is on border management will most likely increase detention of children. Melanie from UNICEF on the panel reiterated that children should never be detained. We have 18 member states in the EU who have adopted the Global Compact, and now we have a political agreement that will most likely increase detention of children. One of the other instruments in the EU Pact is the Screening Directive, which in the political agreement will include screening of people who are potentially undocumented on the territory. How will that be done? it's very hard to see how racial profiling won't be part of that. And another area, and this also builds on what Gabriela and UNODC have referred to in terms of smuggling, the EU has now proposed a revision of the Facilitation Directive, which is the EU's law on smuggling, which has been long awaited. But the exemption of humanitarian assistance isn't in the legislative part, it's in the recitals. And the other area where we see this playing out is not only migration policy, but other policy areas which impede on states' objectives in the SDGs and also access to services and justice. For example, Objective 7 of the GCM, reducing vulnerabilities. The EU has proposed a long-awaited directive on violence against women, but undocumented women will most likely not be able to have safe reporting. They will most likely be transferred to the immigration authorities. And finally, on healthcare, Sweden and Finland are looking at reporting obligations of undocumented migrants to healthcare authorities. So going forward, how do we collectively transform this enforcement-based approach to one that's more on social inclusion and one that's anchored in human rights? First, we would kind of question all of us, and these are more questions for going forward on framing and narratives. When we use language, can we ask ourselves, does it dehumanize migrants? When we look at migration policies and we develop them, do they criminalize migrants? Is there a real effort to develop regular pathways, including regularization? Excellent to hear Colombia just take the floor as the new GFMD chair. Colombia has the biggest regularization in the world. In other policy areas, are they taking into account vulnerabilities caused by migration status, such as in health and education? And finally, multi-stakeholders. Is there a real effort for true dialogue and to really listen? Excellent to see Sao Paulo representing local authorities on the panel. Multi-stakeholder is civil society, migrants, and local authorities, as well as others. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We need to end this panel, so I'm going to make this the last intervention, unfortunately, and hand over to the representative from MYCP. Before I do so, though, please do keep your placards up if you do want to intervene, because as you know, and as I started, there's another session on this theme coming up after the coffee break. So over now to the colleague from MYCP.
Great. Thank you for the floor. My name is Hector, and I'm a migrant from Colombia, and I represent the Migration, Youth, and Children platform. We are Group 4, and by young people to impact the highest levels of international migration policy making. It is an absolute great privilege to join you today and contribute to this critical conversation on behalf of the youth stakeholder group. Today, I'd like to take advantage of this privilege to use my voice to echo the specific youth experiences and priorities we have found through consultations and work with thousands of youth-led organizations and advocates around the globe. At MYCP, we like to call everybody present to, firstly, implement, simplify, and expand regularization mechanisms for children and youth with their families, with a broad and considerate definition of family. In particular, for stateless children born en route, children whose immigrant parents have been deported, unaccompanied and unregistered children, and children from undocumented families. A key example is the current genocide and attacks in Gaza, with children and youth making up more than half of the population, being particularly vulnerable to an immediate risk to the physical and mental health. More than 25,000 children have become orphans, leaving them in a situation of having no family members left and are forced to find shelter and flee alone. Secondly, we would like you to recognize the role of indigenous children and youth as integral stakeholders that possess unique insights and experiences in accurately understanding and predicting the impact of climate change and extractive activities. And in this regard, we need to increase efforts to provide sustainable, accessible, and flexible funding and resourcing to indigenous youth and local communities, ensuring their diverse representation and voices in data-driven and decision-making processes as a step towards a paradigm shift for the much-needed decolonization of data and policy-making processes. Lastly, we would like to call all of you to commit to international cooperation to facilitate youth-centered, disability inclusive, and gender transformative, safe, regular, and orderly migration, both on internally and international levels. That is less bureaucratic and accessible and affordable. This can be done through the implementation and strengthening of relevant international and national legal instruments, ensuring access to services and basic needs regardless of migration status, and providing avenues to legal status and adequate essential services at both sources and destinations. Inter alia, quality education, housing, healthcare, including sexual and reproductive health, training, decent work and employment opportunities, interpretation services, legal support, and the full respect of the human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the next session is really focused on looking forward. And before we finish up, I want to give 30 seconds to each of the panelists so they can make 1 or 2 key points about what we might need to consider as we look forward on saving migrants' lives and protecting their rights. First, Madeline, would you like to kick us off?
Thank you. 30 seconds. I'm going to talk really fast. There's so much to discuss and to pick up here and for all of us to take away as priorities working forward. I really want to thank my fellow panelists, but also the interveners for the incredibly strong and important points they've made that we all need to take heed of today. Let me just touch on 3. Firstly, meaningful participation of refugees and migrants, not only in the processes and words that we are using here today and in other related fora, but also in actions on the ground. This is another key goal and principle in the 2 compacts that is going to reinforce the effective implementation of both. I want to thank the MYCP for their powerful remarks here that remind us of their perspectives and experience that really are vital in informing all of our work in this field. And I also want to recall the leadership and the incredibly articulate and substantive contributions made by refugees last year at the Global Refugee Forum, where I hope many of you might have heard the important role that they are playing also in upholding implementation of these compacts. I also, secondly, want to touch on the theme of decriminalization, both of illegal and irregular entry and stay, as they are called in legislation worldwide, but also activities that are sometimes portrayed as facilitation of smuggling by migrants or refugees, but also by some of the humanitarian organizations that are trying to save lives and uphold rights. This important issue has been mentioned by Gabriella and Brian, and I think it's crucial for us to recall that international law lays down really important principles in this area that are not being sufficiently heeded and respected. For refugees, Article 31 of the 1951 Convention prohibits penalisation of refugees for irregular entry and stay. And this is insufficiently recognised in law and in practice worldwide. And advocacy needs to focus on greater understanding and application of this. But similarly, the smuggling protocols also talk about the fact that people who are not seeking to gain profits should not be recognised or should not be prosecuted for activities. So in instances where organisations are rescuing people at sea or where migrants or refugees are forced to take the tiller of boats, these are not instances where criminal proceedings are an appropriate response. Not only is this contrary to the international instruments that I've just mentioned, but it's also not the right strategy. That's not going to stop the real criminals, who are the people who are exploiting and preying upon vulnerable and desperate people. So this is a crucial concrete area where more advocacy and more evidence needs to be brought to bear to influence state policies. Last point. It's our understanding yesterday, also after the discussions on the potential of the MPTF yesterday, that so far no program has been put forward for consideration for funding under the MPTF under this heading, saving lives and protecting rights. So we'd like to, as UNHCR, to actively encourage partners to consider the scope for submitting such proposals for funding in the next round going forward. And we'd also like to volunteer as HCR to be ready to partner with and work with anyone that would like to put a joint proposal together. We've talked about how we need to do more in this field to address the challenge of saving lives and protecting rights. So let's get some money behind it as well. Thanks very much, Sanjola.
Thanks, Madeline. Great. So we're now on time, 11:30. Brian, if you can maybe take even less than 30 seconds and say one key thing, that would be great. And same for Melanie, Gabriela, and Federico, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Seré bien breve entonces, pero creo que como gobierno local, todo lo que estamos discutiendo en términos de acceso y de restitución de derechos se ocurren en las ciudades, ¿no? Es en ese local donde eso se expresa y es donde es en ese local que se establece la necesidad de acciones concretas. Pero las ciudades no pueden estar solas en ese proceso. Es necesario un diálogo multinivel junto con el gobierno nacional de comprensión del fenómeno migratorio y construcción conjuntas con cada instancia local de gobernanza para que se construyan mecanismos de diálogo, construcción de planeamientos de acogida y de restitución de derechos. En Brasil está en un momento muy promisor en ese sentido. Actualmente se lanzó una red nacional de ciudades acogedoras que tiene ese presupuesto de reunir los gobiernos locales junto con el gobierno federal para pensar mecanismos de construcción de políticas públicas a nivel federal, de manera que se garantice en plenitud y de manera transversal los derechos a las poblaciones inmigrantes, pero también se restitúa los derechos a aquellos inmigrantes que están en situación de vulnerabilidad o con los derechos violentados. En última situación, las ciudades también necesitan de espacios de diálogo y de expresión a nivel internacional, pero también de aporte a fondos internacionales para que aprofundicen y tornen más perfecto sus iniciativas a nivel local y puedan tornar de forma más perenne a través del acceso de financiamiento internacional. Entonces, creo que es una mirada a nivel local, nacional e internacional que las ciudades necesitan estar presentes. Gracias.
Thank you, Brian. Melanie.
Thank you. I think one key point is that the Convention on the Rights of the Child requires that children's best interests have to be a primary consideration in every decision that's taken about children. And that means that states have to set up effective best interest procedures for that to be turned into reality. And in the upcoming network planning for its upcoming year and its new work streams work, we hope that all the work streams are going to take into account that question of children's best interests being central to all of the work plans and all of the upcoming work of the network. Thank you.
Thank you. And echoing on Michelle's comments, the language that further minimizes those behind the facilitation of irregular migration further, hides the real reasons behind the demands for smuggling services. So let's pay attention to the rhetoric and the narratives that we employ. Along the US-Mexico border where I live, in 2020, we got 280 cases of children who were referred for facilitating smuggling services. That number tripled, by the end of the pandemic. So that, again, also leads us to think about who the actual perpetrators are. Especially as a former law enforcement official myself, to think about, what are the pathways to justice that we're building for all. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Just very quickly, on the recommendations that I mentioned, the consultations are still ongoing. So we really encourage you to participate. Tomorrow is Asia Pacific and the Arab states. Friday is for Europe. All the information is available on the network website. So please, if you're interested, register and provide your feedback. Thank you.
Thank you very much, colleagues. I think in the grand scheme of things, having started 10 minutes late, we're only really 5 minutes over the 80 minutes that have been allocated to us. And those 80 minutes have been a wonderfully thoughtful, constructive, critical conversation around protecting migrant lives and protecting migrants' human rights. So thank you very much to all of the panelists and all of the participants. Please do keep your comments and questions and constructive feedback still alive. We're going to start again at 11:50 promptly. So your coffee break has been truncated, unfortunately, but please do come back. I think the conversation, if we're judging by what has been discussed over the last 80 or so minutes, I think it'll be just as instructive and valuable in the next 80 minutes. Thanks a lot.